It's nice and big.
Yay. Okay, very good. All right, well, as if you've been in the current club a while, or if you know the history of the current club, it has changed in ways, I think mostly good over the years. One of the interesting things, though, about the current club that I found intriguing, which I'm not in compliance with tonight, is that originally the presenters were supposed to give a presentation on something that was not their profession. So if you were a biology professor, you didn't present on biology. If you were a political science professor, not political science, etc. And as Jim mentioned, it used to be more of a town gown than so heavily weighted toward people that have some sort of affiliation with the SU. I have done presentations like that before. I did one a couple of years ago on meditation, which I'd be interested in doing again sometime if anybody's interested. And that certainly does not relate to political science very well at all, because I think it was good for people that study politics to meditate. What I find is that many people in my profession drink a lot. As I look through my Facebook, my professional friends on Facebook, someone's always saying, "Oh, I just got a new single malt scotch. I can't wait to try it," or going out for a beer with the buddies or whatever. And I enjoy a good pale ale myself, but meditation is probably healthier, at least all good things moderated. That's right. That's right. And maybe I'll do a presentation about that sometime, but I'm going to break the old rule and go ahead and do a presentation on something I do make a living studying, because people always ask me about it anyway. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right in? Elections 2024, what to expect. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Oh, let me say one more thing about the technology piece before I jump into my presentation. You know, we have our own YouTube channel that I created, and we record these talks and put them up on YouTube. And so feel free to check that out. If you want the link, I can send you to the link if you want to see the other presentations, you new folks, or maybe you want to see one you've seen again because it was just so good. I did not put the discussions about the future of the current club on there. We did send them to a few individuals that wanted to see them, but that was a little different. That wasn't really a presentation, but more of a conversation. Yeah, Rod.
If I searched current club on YouTube, would it get me to the
It
channel?
should.
Okay.
It should. Or maybe try current club Emporia, Kansas. Narrow it a bit. Well, one thing I've noticed, because it does keep track of your views, is that the reigning celebrity, and this is an attempt to overthrow that person, but the reigning celebrity of current club is Bill Hartman, who has more views for his video than the others. And we all know that Bill has a magnetic personality, and that alone may account for the popularity of your talk. But you did also make a PowerPoint with yours, and we combined the PowerPoint with the discussion. And I think, and I don't always use PowerPoint in my teaching, but occasionally I do. I usually don't, actually. But I think for doing this, it makes sense to make a PowerPoint or PowerPoint type presentation, Google Slides, Apple Keynote, any of those kinds of presentation-based apps. And so I did make one, and I would encourage you to do that as well. Because watching an hour-long video of somebody standing there talking, of course, we're all very engaging, we're all very interesting to listen to, but it might not be drawing the viewership. Whereas with Bill's PowerPoint, you had some great pictures too. I think it was the one you did on the prison system, if I remember correctly.
Devil's Front Porch.
Very compelling pictures and so forth. I'm not saying mine's going to be as engaging as that. It's kind of threw this together, but we'll take a look. But just think about maybe doing a PowerPoint, and if you want any help, Jim or I, if you just have some pictures, we can help you put that together. But it seems to get us more views. And that can be part of the future of the current club as well. And so to that end, I have this presentation right here. What do we know? Well, one thing we know is that President Biden is not very popular. The most current data that I could find as I assembled this afternoon, approval of his performance in office is at 38% right now, according to, this was a Reuters poll, and Reuters is pretty good. They do their work right. So, of course, we know that, you know, I could do a whole talk. Maybe I should do my talk on public opinion polls. And we can talk about margins of error and confidence intervals. And, you know, the short answer on public opinion polls is both extremes are wrong. the people that say public opinion polls are worthless because nobody called me, that's not correct. That would be like saying those water quality tests aren't valid because nobody tests the water in my house, right? It's a sampling procedure, right? But the people that treat them as absolute are also in the wrong, because there is that margin of interval, confidence interval, and sources of error. But that isn't what this talk is about. But come to think of it, that would be a good presentation sometime. But what we'll talk about today is just, we'll take it as a given that Reuters does pretty solid work. And it's not looking good for the president. 57% of Americans in the most current data disapprove of his performance in office. And that is not his latest EKG on the bottom. That is in fact his approval and disapproval ratings, with the green line being the approval, which is, he would prefer that those be in the other order. So what's that all about? Well, if you happen to be a Biden supporter, which I'll disclose I am, it's kind of frustrating, because what I would consider to be President Biden's signature act as president is very popular. And that would be the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that's a very kind of catchy title. I don't think the title really describes the bill. When do they these days? But that would be a combination of support for more green energy, support for rebuilding infrastructure, and a number of other provisions, grants to state and local governments. It was, as I say, to me, looking at things as sort of a traditional political scientist, it was passed in his first year in office, which we sometimes call the honeymoon period. It was almost entirely Democrats, although a few Republicans voted for it in the House. I don't think any did in the Senate. No Kansas Republicans did. And so here you have this really important bill, green energy, infrastructure, emerging from COVID. I was just hearing a report today as I listened to the news driving down that many economists now think that the recession that they thought for sure was going to happen after COVID isn't going to happen. They've kind of given up on doing it. It was kind of like predicting the end of the world, right? They kept pushing the date back. Oh, the recession's going to come in October. Oh, no, wait, it's going to come in December. They've kind of just said, I guess the recession's not going to happen. Now, is that because of federal policy? I'm sure that the economists in the room would say, it's complicated, right? But the bottom line is that whatever our good friends who are economists might say about this bill, it's pretty popular with the American people. So why isn't President Biden popular? Well, there's some, and this isn't probably big enough to, well, actually, you can see a little bit. If you look on the right side of the graph, the blue line, the dark blue line, is the people that support it. And so overall, about 65% of the people polled, 89% of Democrats, 54% of independents, and 42% of Republicans. In today's divided hyperpartisan atmosphere, that's pretty good. Those are pretty good numbers. But the problem is, if you look on the left side over here, you see that big red bar there. You probably can't read the text. Those are people that have never heard of it. And that's the problem. Inflation Reduction Act, by whatever name, and President Biden, people that have heard of it like it. Even more than 4 in 10 Republicans, according to this poll. And what's really would be good news for President Biden, more than half of independents. And there aren't that many independents left, but they're still crucial in a close election. But the problem that he's running into is all the people that have never heard of it. After all, we live in this era of clickbait and social media and the culture war, and this is an old-fashioned omnibus spending bill that just doesn't get the coverage that transgender kids using the bathroom does. And so whether you think it's good, bad, or a little bit of both, this landmark piece of legislation is kind of getting ignored. Go ahead, Mike.
Are the people just a cross-section of American adults? Or is it registered voters under those headings, Republican, Independent, Democrat? Or is it likely voters? Who were polled?
It's a random sampling. And I didn't have time to do a deep dive into some of these polls.
Because I think it makes a difference.
It does.
If it was just a general sampling, some of those people in the red who are idiots who didn't know it probably won't vote.
Well, one problem is that people who don't vote also don't answer public opinion polls. And so we're probably looking at mostly people that have some intention of voting. Because they respond to the idea of a public opinion poll about the same way they do to voting. Yes, Amanda.
So I have a question. Does this mean there isn't inflation?
Right, because Congress just passes a law saying there's not inflation, right, Rob?
Well,
That's the way it works.
that's not the way we measure it.
As far as going, perhaps people haven't heard of it because our pocketbooks are being pinched.
That's true.
Like, for example, just the same exact groceries that I buy at Aldi's for the week for my family used to be $1.50. That was in October. Today, the same exact groceries at Aldi's, so I'm not buying anything different, is $2.10.
Yeah, we have the same thing at our house.
So
Yeah,
maybe people haven't heard of it because either A, it's not working, or B, they're like, well, it's not gonna inflation.
well, I thought about, maybe I should have done this, Amanda. I thought about doing a slide just on inflation. But one of the problems with, inflation is coming under control. And the conventional wisdom anyway would be, and I've got economists here to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's because of the actions of the Fed, which is indirectly related to the president, since those terms are staggered deliberately, so the president can't fire everybody and put in their people. But the problem with inflation is that inflation coming under control doesn't put prices back to where they were before. It slows the rate of increase. So people like you and me, if I do shopping in my family, and I hear you, we're not gonna see those prices go back. We're just gonna see the increases slow down. And I thought about doing a slide just about inflation, but I chose not to. What do you want to add to that?
Well, what Amanda did is similar to what we do. We take a market basket of goods and keep that same market basket over time and watch what happens each month.
Yeah.
And it's a weighted market basket. But, and you're correct, the Fed has some control over inflation, but so does the government because it's tax and spending policies.
Oh, that's true.
And the government is continuing to stimulate the economy quite a bit.
That's true. Which
Also,
makes it harder.
industry, I mean, industry has an input also, and that's, I think sometimes that's because it is not part of the government. We have a tendency to discount that.
But that's not policy.
Right.
That's how the economy works.
Yeah, yeah,
Certainly
You're,
makes.
you're right. Yeah,
but that's, I mean, sometimes prices are going up, not because of,
yeah, and some prices are going up and some prices are going down.
yeah,
Look at what happens to the price of television sets.
yeah.
Yeah, they've been coming down. Other things have been coming down.
Gasoline and things.
Yeah.
When they say that inflation is going up or down, that's a amalgam average of
Yeah.
a whole bunch of things, some going up, some going
It's
down.
true.
And if the things that you buy are on the side that are still going up or have stayed up, then it feels like inflation is not going down.
Yeah.
But if you're on the side that you're buying, more gas for your truck or whatever, then you're thinking, oh, it is going down. It sort of depends.
It certainly makes me feel good that I planted my garden today, but it points to me making it larger.
It does. It does. I'm personal. Oh, yeah.
What degree do you think this singular issue hinges the political outcome of the next election? For people like my parents, who would have been blue, right? They see this, that they don't have as much spending power, that they're retired people, so they don't have a giant pot to pull from to spend on groceries.
Yeah.
They may be swayed to vote for someone that otherwise they find reprehensible.
Well, they may not be alone either. My personal opinion, I really don't like the name Inflation Reduction Act. The bill has very little to do with reducing inflation. In fact, it was stimulus. It
Yeah.
could worsen it, but kind of to your point that actually fiscal policy does matter. It's not just the Fed. And the marketing people and the political whiz kids also, oh, you need a catchy title. And this bill was really about infrastructure and clean energy and some other things, which I personally support, really didn't have anything to do with reducing inflation. And so it may have also been a dumb idea to call it that.
I mean, my understanding is the purpose of the title was to get Joe Manchin's vote.
Probably was, and it worked
Yeah.
for that one bill,
Yeah.
not necessarily for anything else. But there's a problem.
That he could be swayed by a title.
Yeah, because his criticism of the original bill was it was kind of increasing inflation. And I,
All right, well,
He's retiring.
Yeah.
we're all geeks here and we love talking about inflation, but I want to make a few other points that we could talk more about inflation at the end if you want to. But that's actually not the issue that appears to be driving President Biden's unpopularity. It's the US-Mexico border. Overall, and I know this is hard to read except for Bob, his front row seat. But what you'll see is that the top issue for voters overall is the economy. That's also the top issue for Democrats. And then the second issue for voters overall is immigration, and that's the top issue for Republicans. And as we know, former President Trump branded that issue of immigration very, very early on when he entered as a dark horse candidate, and we know what he's done with that since. I think another way of looking at it, being kind of political sciencey, is that they're both important issues. But if you are a voter that's worried about both, you may have more confidence in Trump's ability to deal with immigration than you do in Biden's ability to deal with the economy. Now, I'm not endorsing that point of view, but it may be a question of not only which issue is most important to you, but which candidate you think is most effective in dealing with that issue. And Biden has never really taken hold of the issue of economic recovery the same way that Trump has of immigration, which again is ironic when we have economists saying, whoops, we were wrong, there's not going to be a recession, and a number of other very positive economic indicators. But it doesn't poll well for Biden. Immigration does for Trump. And by the way, if you're looking at these zigzaggy lines, what this shows, for example, is that the economy, 22% of all, 18% of Democrats, and 29%. So Democrats are kind of all over the place on the issues they think are most important. Republicans are more concentrated with just those two issues. But it's still their top issue, and then it drops down to the second issue for Republicans. Immigration drops all the way down here. Only 7% of Democrats would rank that as the top issue, and then it zigzags back up to 36 for Republicans.
I think it's interesting to look at the environment.
Yes.
Which way is environment? Michael, can you point to the environment?
I would be more than happy to point to the environment. It's out there. The environment is right here, and it doesn't poll well. It's 6% overall, 10% of Democrats. That really surprises me. And then a very steep drop here.
It goes
I
up
don't-
to the bottom, yeah.
Yeah, it's down here at less than 1%. I think, and I know many of you all, I think I'd get some agreement here. Really, if we're being reasonably objective, you can make an argument that the environment should be the first issue, that climate change is the most existential issue that humanity faces right now. But it's not full, and there are provisions for transition to green energy in the Inflation Reduction Act. But it's not polling well with voters. It hasn't landed with voters.
Is it possible that people aren't making the connection between environment and climate change that?
Yeah, it is possible.
uh,
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Sometimes they may think of EPA and all the terrible things.
That's right, coming onto your land and
Yeah.
testing the water. You're right. You're right. Like I say, I think I might do a whole talk on polling sometimes. People are amazingly sensitive to wording in polls. Just one simple word change can radically alter polling results. And that might be an example, Joe, of where that's happening.
Well, isn't the unemployment going down? Hasn't Biden been creating hundreds of thousands of jobs every month? Now, why is that not boosting the economy? You having more people working and earning decent
It
wages?
is. I mean, it's boosting it so much, the Fed has to slow it down with interest rate.
To me, it seems that Trump is better at publicizing his point of view.
Yeah,
Biden is terrible at it.
yeah.
Biden's always been a bad campaigner. I mean, from when he was senator, he was terrible. And he made gaffes back then. So if anybody thinks he's not gonna make any more gaffes in the future, be prepared. There's a way to overcome that, but he's not publicizing his pluses. Trump is, and Trump's been doing it for months now.
Yeah.
And Biden ought to turn that thing into first gear, because he's an idol right now.
Yeah, I agree. As I say, I think the problem is that Biden hasn't owned the issue of the economy the way Trump has the issue of immigration. Those are clearly the two top issues. And another issue that might be a problem is the Democrats are kind of all over the place. It's not clear that his base thinks that those are the most important. I mean, they are the most important, but they barely outrank others. And that's a whole other thing that I would like to make some time to talk about. I don't have a PowerPoint slide about it, but we can still talk about it, which is that in most congressional districts and state legislative districts today, the way you win the election is you win your primary. There's very little two-party competition. You win your primary and you're done. And if you're a Democrat and you want to win the primary, you move to the left. If you're a Republican, you want to win your primary, you move to the right. You don't move to the center. Back in my day, when I was in grad school in the 1990s, that was what we studied, that things that had names like median voter theorem and Duverger's law. You got to move in toward the center because that's where the median voter is. The median voter determines the election. Today, though, in many elections, that's simply not true. There are even entire states that aren't competitive. For example, there's not a single statewide office in Kansas occupied by a Democrat. Not one.
Governor.
Except for governor. You're right. You're right.
But aren't the
Pardon me, Laura
independents,
Kelly.
aren't independents in the middle?
But there are very few of them.
But aren't they the swing voters?
They are, but one of the problems with independents, Mike, is that the independents, there's a significant chunk of voters that self-identify as independents. The problem is when you track their voting behavior, they're partisans. There are very few voters who vote Democratic 50% of the time and Republican 50% of the time. There are people that say they're independents, but overwhelmingly act as partisans. So true independents are very rare. They exist, and the numbers are so close right now. I mean, what's the Republican majority in the House now? Like 3 seats, 5?
3.
That it's close enough that those true independents could still swing the election. But the number of people that self-identify as independents and the number of people that are vastly different. A lot of people don't like being labeled, but their voting behavior indicates that they're partisans.
I guess not to get back to Paul, but one of the things I keep wondering about is that when they say Republicans, are they self-identified Republicans or are they people who register? Because it seems to be, at least nationally, you see a lot of national figures who used to be Republicans who are no longer Republicans.
Right.
And I don't know how much that cuts across the nation.
So usually we use the 7-point Likert scale. It's strong. Let's see, we have strong Republican, lean Republican, independent, leaning Republican, independent, lean Democrat, weak Democrat, strong Democrat. And usually independent leaning are more partisan than the weak Republicans and weak Democrats.
And this is based on asking them.
Right. We read the scale to them and say, just stop me when you get to the right one. And you randomize which one you start with.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Good questions. Good questions. Definitely need to do that public opinion polling. But the other thing is, as I say, since people over-report that they're independents, we also just look at just flat voting behavior. And we see a huge decline in ticket splitting since the 1980s. People behave as partisans, and there's a good deal less ticket splitting. So that's another part of the puzzle as well. Right? This is fun. All right. Good news for Democrats. Voters do not like the Dobbs v. Women's Health Services decision. It polls very, very poorly. Here are your numbers over here. I'll read them to you. Right now from this particular poll, which is Pew Research, which is one of the best in my opinion. They are funded out of an endowment. They don't have a partisan agenda. And they can just do what they want without spinning. They don't have to spin to the news media or political party. Pew Charitable Trust, wonderful source of data and reports. And so what their numbers are running, about 62% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases, and about 36% do not. And big shock here, there's a big partisan split. About 84% of Democrats and about 40% of Republicans. But notice how much higher the percentage of Republicans saying it should be legal. 4 in 10 Republicans versus fewer than 2 in 10 Democrats are saying it should not. So not only do most Americans think that abortion should be legal in nearly all cases, but more Republicans cross over than Democrats. And where you can see that is in Kansas, right? The first state in America to vote on whether or not abortion should be legal after the Dobbs decision in August of 2022, where the pro-choice side prevailed by 18 points. And that's mostly because, well, it's a couple of reasons. One is turnout. Pro-choice voters really turned out. Anti-abortion voters almost always turn out. They're very well mobilized by some churches, not all, but some churches and other religious organizations and anti-abortion groups. So it's just a given that even in low turnout elections, your anti-abortion voters are going to turn out. What's different today since Dobbs is that pro-choice voters also turn out. And they used to be a lot more iffy. Partly, maybe, I'm speculating here, but because they just assumed that Roe v. Wade would never be overturned. So they might say, well, you know, yeah, I'm pro-choice, but I'm really worried about the economy. So I'm going to vote for this other candidate. So what Dobbs has really done is it's pushed those numbers up among pro-choice voters to similar to the ones that we've always seen among anti-abortion voters. And also, they're better mobilized. Those groups have more money, they have more resources to turn out voters, and they can now match the anti-abortion voters in terms of turning voters out. And we're right here in the test case, you know, good old Republican Kansas, where not amending the state constitution to allow the criminalization of abortion won by 18 percentage points. And I think a lot of that reflects those Republican crossover voters. So its turnout is a big part of it. Turnout was really strong in Johnson County in 2022, and it trended very heavily toward the pro-choice side. But if you look at like Chase County, you know, Chase County is so red you could read by it at night. You know, and the what they call the value of them both amendment did win in Chase County, so the anti-abortion side, but the margin was much smaller. I think it won by 10 points in Chase County. Well, Republicans typically win by more than 30 points. So that's a really good example of where you had Republican crossover voters. Again, value them both passed in Chase County, but not by the kind of margins you'll see for Republicans there. And you see the same thing out in Western Kansas and other heavily Republican places. Lyon County is split, but the city of Emporia is more blue, outlying Lyon County is more red. But the vote no, which was the pro-choice side, won by about 15 points in Lyon County. And so my point here is that this is an issue that Democrats may be able to use to kind of counteract some of that negativity toward the president, that voters are pretty fired up in their opposition to Dobbs, even in a state like Kansas. Now, that doesn't mean that President Biden's going to win Kansas. He's not. But this one could give voters second thoughts. Yes.
Michael, was the Dobbs decision in any way a factor electing the Democrat who took George Santos's place?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that just about any Democrat could have won that seat given who is vacating it, but I haven't studied that election.
That was like Jimmy Carter winning because Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon. You know, whoever was the Democrat was going to win.
Well, it also hinged on immigration. That was one of the big litmus tests.
Yeah, okay.
And I think the Democrat kind of pardoned Joe Biden on immigration. He was critical of Biden's, so.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing about immigration that I'm sure y'all followed this, that President Biden was ready to sign a bipartisan immigration bill if Congress had passed it. Really strong immigration rights advocates didn't like the bill. They thought it was too anti-immigration. He said he'd sign it. And of course, the Republicans in the House scuttled it. And the conventional wisdom would say whatever reasons they give, it's so that President Trump could use that as an issue in the fall. So Biden has said he's going to campaign on this. I was about to sign immigration reform and they killed it to use it as a political issue. But right now, anyway, that's not working for him.
Well, he hasn't done much
we'll
with
see.
it. You know, and give him time to stump around the country. I think it'll negate it. I think there's a damn good chance that what the Republicans in the House did will negate what they're, saying that Biden hasn't done anything on immigration. I think there's a good chance for that. Unless they're just completely just not listening to the news. They are listening.
Yes, well, and that's the other problem, like going back to that earlier slide, you all and I, we do listen to and watch and read the news, and many Americans do not. And so there's gonna be a big information gap there.
Well, plus
Because-
there's siloed news.
Right.
That's true. So, I mean, how many, like all those people that have never heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, and again, I hate that name. I really wish they hadn't done that, but they didn't ask me. That was their mistake. But by whatever name, look at all the voters that just have never heard of it. And this was a huge deal. This is a landmark piece of legislation, but many Americans have never heard of it. So when a group like us evaluates, what do you think the American people are going to do in November? We have to remember there's a pretty big information gap. Most people are far more concerned with what they're going to cook for dinner or picking up the kids from soccer practice or whether or not the Kansas City Chiefs are winning. The answer to that is yes, than they are about politics. And so that's something to keep in mind.
A poll indicating what percentage of voters are single issue voters, because what you had on
Right.
before, we're talking about those being the top issues among Democrats, but if they're not the only issue, then it's gonna be a mixture of all those issues underneath.
Yeah.
But what percentage are single issue voters?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. It's I will tell you that traditionally, for those who are single issue voters, they overwhelmingly, the issue is abortion rights, and those issues are anti-abortion. And again, before Dobbs, that pro-choice, people who are pro-choice have been in the majority pretty consistently since 1973. The problem is that those voters, very few of them were single issue voters. Whereas the core of the anti-abortion movement, they were single issue voters. And that's one of the reasons why this group that makes up, what are our numbers here? About 36% of the American people has been able to make so much headway, and why in some of our largest states like Texas and Florida, abortion is criminalized now in almost all circumstances, is because not because of their numbers, even in those states, but because they're willing to be single issue voters and the pro-choice voters are not. And so again, Dobbs has started to shift that, but will it be enough for President Biden and other Democrats? I don't know. And I'm sorry, Mike, that's a great question. I don't know it's going to vary over time.
Sure.
But most Americans are not single issue
It
voters.
reminds me a little bit, I read a book a while back about prohibition, and they said that it was actually a minority of the country that wanted prohibition,
Yeah.
but it was a single issue.
It was a,
minority of the country.
yeah.
Yeah.
Very active.
Well,
Yeah,
and nothing gets people out more than giving them
Yeah.
that's right.
that. So,
Well, and that's a whole other issue that even is probably beyond the scope of my presentation, but there's so much voting against.
Ken, did I miss you? Did you want?
No, I'm pretty bored.
That it works. The 2020 election had the highest, in terms of raw numbers, the highest voter turnout in American history. That means that the most votes for president of the United States ever cast in all of history were cast for Joe Biden, and the second most were cast for Donald Trump. Now, and in terms of percentages, the turnout was higher than it had been in decades. The problem is that most of those voters, we think, were voting against. The Biden voters were voting against Trump, and the Trump voter, well, the Trump has his core. But many of them were probably voting against Biden. That seems to work for turning out voters, but it may not work as well for creating a consensus to govern, which has always bothered me. If you get elected because you're not Donald Trump, you really have a consensus. I mean, look at how divided the House is. How about in the Senate too? It's 50-50. What kind of a consensus do you have to govern and pass legislation then? So it's great for turning out voters. In fact, voters are more likely to turn out to vote against than vote for. But it's not very good for creating a coalition where you can actually pass stuff. And then, of course, if you're in the incumbent, you're running on your record. And that would be Joe Biden. Right now, actually, we have two presidents running on their records, which is going to be kind of interesting. Right? Good stuff. Former President Trump's approval is actually somewhat higher than President Biden's is. This one is from 538. And this is Nate Silver. You've probably heard of him. He's the polling guru who invented a formula that's proprietary. He calls it a secret sauce. Back in the early 2000s, where he doesn't go off the results of one public opinion poll, he amalgamates public opinion polls in order to come up with his estimates. And they've been pretty accurate. As a matter of fact, in the days prior to the 2016 election, when a lot of people were dismissing Donald Trump, Nate Silver published several blog entries titled "Donald Trump Has a Path to the Presidency." So he called it, and most others did not. So he's been a big deal for more than 20 years. His amalgamated polling right now has Trump's unfavorable at 51.9% and his favorable at 43.6%. That is considerably higher favorable than Biden's. And also notice the stability. You don't see a lot of variation over time. This date is January 1st, 2022. So 2021 would be somewhere around here. Now, some of that may be because Trump's not in office. But basically, when it comes to Trump, you're on whatever side you're on. So the variability is mostly Biden, because most people have made up their mind about Trump.
What is the blue?
Blue is favorable, which I would have coded that red just to be consistent, but that's not what they did.
Okay.
Yeah. So Trump is actually more popular, according to these polls anyway, than Biden is at this time. And this, I think, is why it's the US-Mexico border. I already showed you some data showing that for most Americans, that this is their lead issue, outranking the economy. And this particular one, this is another Pew Research. This one I really trust. And they've got 45% call the situation at the US-Mexico border a crisis, 32% call it a major problem. This appears to be President Biden's Achilles heel and President Trump's, Trump card. I struggle with this quite a bit. I mean, I have my personal opinions, of course, but just as a political scientist, again, when I was in grad school in the 90s, we were taught to analyze political behavior from the perspective of self-interest, drawing on economics and rational choice theory and all that. That made a big, in the 90s, that was really big in political science too. Economists adopted it a little earlier. And so we look at things like, well, like your examples, Amanda, how much money are you paying for groceries, right? That's your pocketbook, that's your family. And we assume that for most voters, that's going to drive decision-making. How much do I pay for groceries? Do I have a job? Are my kids going to get jobs after they graduate from high school or trade school or college? Very basic personal things. Voters act on their self-interest just like economic actors act on their self-interest. Well,
They ostensibly do.
right. And I loved my graduate school education. Learned a lot of cool stuff, but you have to keep re-educating yourself as you go through your career. And the reason I say that is because, and again, I'm kind of editorializing here, but I get it that if you live in a border county in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, or California, you feel the impact of that immigration. There are people cutting through your yard. There are parks that are kind of occupied zones. There's, all kinds of stuff going on. And some of the anecdotal reports from Texas, which has really been at the center of a lot of the news reporting on this, is that communities are frustrated with both sides. They don't like they feel overwhelmed by immigration, but they also don't like some of the actions of the state government and the way the state government and the federal government seem to be fighting each other. And so I can see how if you lived in one of those border counties, this would be your top issue. But what I struggle with is what is the self-interest for someone living in Kansas or Missouri or Idaho who is saying, immigration is hurting me personally. Did immigration cause the cost of those groceries to go up? Did immigration cause have you personally lost your job to an immigrant? have you personally been a victim of a crime committed by an immigrant? And by the way, some data indicates that undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit felonies than American citizens are, partly because they're terrified of being deported. And so they tend to be very, very, very cautious in all sorts. They don't even drive with a tail light out for fear that it could lead to deportation.
They're also more likely to work in your fields for next to nothing,
Right. In fact,
which actually has more to do with your grocery prices
that's right.
than coming across the border.
And of all the people against immigrants, Cesar Chavez was totally against the union busting immigrants
Yeah.
from Mexico.
Yeah.
And he was a Mexican.
Yeah.
One of my students did a study on that.
Yeah,
As a fascinating and kind of a disturbing study.
Yeah.
But
even violently against them.
that part she didn't mention. But like I say, for people in those counties along the border, hey, I get it. This has got to be really, really hard. But I just can't see how someone in Emporia, Kansas can point to, I lost my job to an immigrant. Immigrants cause my groceries to cost more. I've been a victim of a crime committed by, or a close member of my family. And so clearly these identity issues, which is, except for the people actually living along the border, seem to be driving this as far as I can say, because as you kind of hinted, Jim, there are economists who would argue that many Americans benefit from the presence of it. Now, of course, it's subjective whether you say we benefit culturally. I, of course, would be on the side that we do. But that's subjective, right? But even economically, and I think of the towns in Kansas that would be in decline if immigrants weren't settling there, because most of the kids that grew up there move out and they're not coming back. But immigrants will take those jobs. Immigrants will join those churches. Immigrants will buy up those houses and rehabilitate them. So I don't get it, but I think it has to be that that the kind of politics I learned, you know, the self-interest has been displaced by identity politics. That I think this is about what people see on the news and social media and that sense of American identity, because I really struggle to see how outside of border counties, most of these voters saying it's the number one issue can say, it's hurting me personally. I just lost my job because of immigration. And I don't think they can.
There's a possible way, I think, besides an economic issue. And that is when you hear the stories of a mother and her two kids walking 100 miles or whatever they walk from Guatemala or whatever country they're from, because the gangs there are going to recruit their kids and they don't want that to happen. There's stories about that. Americans hear those stories. Americans want those people not to have to suffer that. And so I think they can say, yeah, there's a crisis on the border without it necessarily affecting them economically. When we get so many tens of thousands across the border every day, many of them seeking asylum, and you might say to yourself, I think they should be granted asylum. But our country isn't. Barack Obama, for example, deported more back than Trump did. But it was all sort of not known by many people. So I think there's another reason besides economics, and that is identifying and feeling sorry for those people that are amassing at the borders, trying to have a better life.
You may be right, which, I mean, that would seem to cut in the direction of people wanting more liberalizing immigration.
Control, better control, you know, and you're not going to get better control until you go back to the countries and help them get rid of the problems that they have
I agree.
that's causing them to come up here.
Yeah.
And that's what Harris was supposed to do. And that was early on, that was her main job as vice president, and she's failed miserably.
I agree that that's important.
I did, but that was a while back. I mean, we
Okay.
can continue down this track or,
It's up to you.
well.
You got another question somewhere, was it?
She's made the point.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that there could be indirect causality rather than a direct correlation. So for the children of immigrants, there seems to be, at least, you know, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, a resentment amongst older immigrants that the newer immigrants are not coming in,
Legally.
legitimately,
Yeah.
legally through what they did before.
No, I've heard that before.
I'm married to a naturalized citizen from the Middle East. And all my relatives are from the Middle East. I have no relatives that are American. They're all dead. They're furious. Because they all came, took 10, 15 years getting in here. They are furious.
Yes, my grandpa, so my mother remarried and when I was about 10, and his father's father was stuck in Cuba and died without the family being able to get back there. And so that sense of loss of we suffered, we did this the right way, and now not willing to sort of come along and say, this is okay. No, this is not okay. You do what's right, and then you get to reap the benefits.
I've heard that too. I have a friend that used to be a elementary school principal in Texas, near the border, and she said that the tension between the Latino kids that were their families were naturalized American citizens or born United States citizens, and those who were undocumented were much worse than either group had with the non-Hispanic white kids. So yeah, there's probably something to that.
I think the other point, and it's kind of connected to that, is there's so much misinformation out there. For example, I hear a lot of people talk about the fentanyl crisis, which is a crisis, but they tie that to illegal immigration, and it's really not connected. To illegal immigration.
No, it started with overprescription of opioids.
Yeah, and also most of the people who bring fentanyl into the country are illegal immigrants. They're coming in over the border. They're just hiding it away. It's the illegal immigrants.
Well, and actually, I mean, the volume of fentanyl that's coming into the country couldn't possibly be carried. It's gotta be freighted in.
Right.
And that's where most of it's coming in, is freight.
And even the idea of the, resentment of the people, it's this misinformation that there are open borders. There aren't.
No,
These
there
people aren't immediately granted citizens. Nobody's proposing that you take all these people that are walking over and immediately grant them citizenship. These are mostly people, refugees who are asking asylum, and 90% of them are refused.
Well, and Congress is underfunded. That bill would have included more funding for the administrative law courts, which process those. But my understanding, and y'all are just as knowledgeable as me, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that, well, a couple of things I wanted to throw in, that people are crossing the border and surrendering themselves for asylum. So I wish to be processed for asylum because of the underfunding and because of the volume of people coming. It is a lot. Let's admit that it is a lot of people. That will be several years before they get a hearing. And this is what I can't imagine. They don't get work visas. So they're to stay here for several years and can't work legally. I don't get that at all. And it really speaks to the resiliency of people that they can even survive. But I do know that bill that Biden said he would sign, it was bipartisan, it included more money for that processing of those claims for asylum. Another thing I wanted to throw in that I thought was interesting, maybe you've heard this, is that all that barbed wire and all those barriers that the Texas state government is putting up, well, there are barriers in the river, but the ones on land are not keeping the undocumented, or well, they're not undocumented, they're documented, the asylees from getting in. That's not their goal. It keeps the federal agents from getting to them. Yeah. Their purpose is to block the federal agents from going down and processing them. If somebody can go walk 1,000 miles, they can get around some barbed wire, but they're actually blocking the federal officials. They have to cut through the barbed wire to go down and process the people, which is kind of crazy in my opinion.
I heard one immigration expert say that one of the reasons for the great increase of immigration is actually the improving economy in the world, that they need to raise a certain amount of money in order to make it up here.
Yeah.
And they're more able to do that now than they were 5 years ago.
It's a fair point, right?
I want to bring this point about your question earlier about asking Kansas how the immigration problem has influenced them. And my comparison is, I live over by Industrial Park number 3, and those of you who work on the west side of town, how many signs for hiring bonuses? $1,500 to everything. I mean, the number of employment opportunities in this town are fantastic. It sort of cuts into an economic issue that may be facing us in terms of thinking about these kinds of things.
I can have next day delivery on anything you want in regard to identification that's phony. In fact, one of my employees at the
Well,
university.
but it doesn't answer the problem, and it doesn't
That's right.
create, most
Yeah.
people wouldn't do that illegality,
There
but.
are tons of them that do that.
Well,
The
but I
London
think- I think
economists
we
point out that
today
one
are
point two
checking
trillion
information.
dollars of unidentifiable social security, 1.2 trillion is in social security suspense funds, and they'll never be drawn out because they were put in by
That's right.
illegals.
There are even
They'll never
studies
be drawn out.
show that people working under falsified social security numbers have extended the life of the social
That's it.
security
That's right.
trust fund.
We're all
Yeah,
benefiting from it.
Then-
that's it.
I do have a question. It takes us a little bit sideways, but, so. This is a historian coming out, but I can see a lot of parallels with what's going on with Texas and, the nullification crisis of 1832. I don't understand how there hasn't been more done to address Texas basically saying, I have the right to nullify a law if it's not in the best interest of, we've heard this before under
We
Andrew
have.
Jackson.
Yeah,
And even
and the
then,
Civil War.
right, he said, Supreme Court said, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And right now, Texas is basically going,
Yeah,
yeah, we can, so.
by the way, Texas
Yeah.
run by the party of law and order.
That's right.
And they also,
So we're gonna get back to-
they also have a lot of faith in their first constitution as a republic.
I share your
Except we can leave
concern.
and don't have to listen to you.
Nullification was supposed to have died in the Civil War. And if states are going down this road, and you're absolutely right, there are.
Right.
They are, it makes you wonder what the future of our country is.
So how can Texas not be in compliance with the Supreme Court?
Well,
And how can, and what I'm really getting at is, I don't understand why we don't hear more from the bully pulpit of president.
I think that's a good question.
I think it's too
Yeah.
much of an issue. Yeah, remember, there could be laws, if they're not enforced, and there's lots of laws that aren't enforced. There's lots of rules at ESU that aren't enforced. And if the federal government has decided it's gonna be too much of a disaster to try and go down there and kick out the state people and put our people there, it's just gonna be too much of a riotous disaster. So they're just ignoring it for now. I think
Well,
that's the reason why.
But I think to your point, that may have consequences later.
Well,
Well-
as a parent, if my toddler says to me, hey, I'm gonna have a cookie before dinner, no, dear, you can't, and she eats the cookie anyway, there are consequences later.
Well,
Listen,
there would be a certain parallel perhaps in the civil rights movement, where it did take the federal government to send troops in.
Yeah.
To actually enforce the law, and that may be a better comparison.
Yeah.
That maybe President Eisenhower had a little more political,
Sent the US military.
yeah.
That's true.
Maybe he had a little more political.
sent the US
access.
military
Yeah,
to turn the Arkansas National Guard at Little Rock Central High School.
yeah.
I'm running low on battery, and I don't want Bob to miss these last two slides. But it did bring to mind something. It's one of my favorite political quotes, not so much because it makes me happy, but because I think it's accurate. And it's what President Clinton said, then former President Clinton by that time, after September 11th. He said, at this time, the American people will sooner support somebody who's strong and wrong than someone who's weak and right. And I thought then, and I think now, that whatever his personal failings, President Clinton's a pretty astute analyst of politics. So that might be something to think about there. Let me show you these really quickly before my battery dies. Let's turn to Kansas a bit. I don't expect much very exciting to happen in Kansas. Kansas currently has 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. I did want to show you this. This is how they redrew the 3rd district around Kansas City. Look how much it's redrawn. The black line was the district from 2012 to 2022, and the green is the current district. So they cut off the northern half of Wyandotte County, that's Kansas City, Kansas, and they added all the rest of Miami plus Franklin and Anderson counties. They thought that would make Democratic Congresswoman Sharice Davids vulnerable. She ended up winning by about the same margin she had 2 years earlier. And so I don't think she's going anywhere. In fact, I think she might be something of a rising star in the Democratic caucus in the House. So I think she's there. I think she's staying. Also, I want to bring to mind, we're in the second district now in Emporia. Look at how the second district is shaped. I love this part right here. Where it's not quite as narrow as that district in North Carolina that was one lane of a freeway. But this is
Wow.
quite the work of abstract art, I think. So this is, and I wanted to point out, Emporia has shifted districts. Emporia used to be in what we call the Big First, currently represented by Tracy Mann. It no longer is. Emporia, see, here's the old line right here, and Emporia was west of that old line. You see that? Emporia is now in the second, which is represented by Jake LaTurner. But I don't expect, I just wanted an excuse to show you this map. But I don't expect any major shift in our congressional delegation. We are taking this one off from, or you all, I should say, since I'm a Missourian, but from a Senate election. There's no Senate seat on the ballot because every 3 elections you sit one out since they're staggered 6-year terms. But I do think these districts are interesting, even though I don't think our congressional districts here in Kansas will be very interesting. I think it'll be, all the incumbents will be reelected. And then one more. This is a little bit more interesting, I think. This is not a map of how these counties vote, red or blue. This is a map of shifts between 2016 and 2020. And so the blue is not a county that voted Democratic, it's a county that shifted toward being more Democratic. And the red is not a county that voted Republican, it's a county that shifted toward being more Republican. And of course, what really jumps out at you in Kansas is Johnson County, home of more than 1 in 4 Kansas, more than 1 in 5 Kansans, and about a quarter of the entire Kansas economy in Johnson County in suburban Kansas City. And look how deep blue that is. Johnson County did not vote for a Republican or for a Democrat for president between Woodrow Wilson and Joe Biden. Johnson voted for Alf Landon, Wendell Wilkie. Alf Landon was from Kansas, of course. Wendell Wilkie, Barry Goldwater, but it also voted for Joe Biden. So look at how deep blue that is. And I think a lot of that is probably the Dobbs decision. There are a lot of college educated women in Johnson County, and they're pretty fired up. And Representative Davids is probably a fit for that constituency. And so that's a big shift.
League of Women Voters in Johnson.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. No other county is that deep blue as Johnson. Douglas got even more Democratic. You are seeing some bluing in Sedgwick County, which is Wichita, but it's not nearly as dramatic as Johnson. But Sedgwick County used to be reliably Republican, and at least the city of Wichita has become pretty competitive for Democrats. And the current mayor of all things identifies as a libertarian. There's that warning, but we've got a teeny bit more. And then the other one that's kind of interesting, I think, is Riley County. It's a very pale blue. That's Manhattan, which is kind of going the direction of college towns and becoming more part of at least purple, if not even a bit blue for Kansas. And then you'd think that Kansas, rural Kansas, was already red in 2016, but look at how these counties in western Kansas trended even more for Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. And of course, this is misleading because most of the people in Kansas live in just a few counties, urban counties. So Kansas, it doesn't mean the whole state trended that way, but Trump's only getting more popular in many of these rural counties. So I wanted to make sure to show you that. And again, apologies to Bob, my computer could die at any minute, but I hope this has been useful. And we've had some good discussions, but if we want to have some more discussion, let's do it. What else do y'all want to talk about?
I just had one quick, I didn't see on there my top issue, which is democracy. Is that even on
It's
the radar?
Well, I could do a presentation about that too.
That's why when you looked at that one thing that had the spaghetti moving, that the Democrats were so sort of wishy-washy almost.
Yeah.
Is that I think they have a tendency to view it in a more holistic way.
Yeah.
As opposed to the single issue.
But I guess I'm thinking that, you know, I've heard a lot of people who were very conservative say that they're gonna vote against Trump because the result will be a loss of democracy. I mean, that's their number. And to me, that's the number one issue in this next election.
Have you heard of
Do we want
Project,
democracy?
have you heard of Project 2025? We're actually, it's gonna be in the article, it comes out next week, we're gonna talk about it. But it's a plan that's been put together over the last few years. Literally on day one to replace the bureaucracy with.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
At first, yeah.
I've read parts of it.
Replace it with what?
With literally to weed out the bureaucracy, of. And replace it with loyalists.
The deep state.
Yeah, get rid of the deep state and replace it with loyalists.
There's one other interesting phenomena coming on, just simply because I'm very close to the Middle Eastern contacts, both Christian and Muslim. Biden is very unpopular among them now for his support of Israel.
Yeah.
Extremely
In
unpopular,
fact, tomorrow in Michigan, there is a movement
not to vote none of the above.
to,
We're getting literature about
uncommitted
that.
is what, in Michigan, they're called uncommitted. So this will
Uncommitted,
be,
yeah,
this will be like
It's
what happened to
huge.
Haley in
and
Nevada.
it could cost them Michigan.
I've heard that. I struggle a little bit with the idea that they would vote for Trump. And remember,
They
if you
just won't
don't,
vote at all.
right, but that's only half the loss. If you switch your vote from one side to the other,
That's
that
the big loss.
costs one a vote and benefits one. If you switch to none of the above, it's only half the
Well,
damage.
in numeric